My name's Ann Pettifor, and I predicted the financial crisis in 2003 and again in 2006 when I wrote a book called The Coming First World Debt Crisis. And I'm the author of The Production of Money, which appeared this year in February 2017. The private banking system is responsible for about 95% of the money supply. And in the United States, they're responsible for 99% of the money supply. Nothing to do with the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England. But the question is, how is that money created, and for whom is it created, and for what purpose is it created? And quite often it's created for gambling and speculation. And I argue that we should, as a society and a democracy, be demanding that the money should be invested in our needs for investment, our needs for good public services, for good transport, and so on. So the British general election is exposing once again the fallacy, the ignorance that there is around the production of money and how easy it is for governments to finance expenditure, especially in a crisis as we are in now. You know, it's 10 years after the financial crisis and our economy is still not recovered. Our private sector is still heavily indebted and very weak and very lacking in confidence. And it's at times like that that government has to step in to support the private sector by investing. But the arguments here in Britain, as there are around the world, is there is no money. You know, there seems to be a lot of money for bailing out the banks, a lot of money for building nuclear weapons, but there's no money for elderly care or for the weak and the vulnerable or for decent education or for the arts even. And so what I argue is that there is enough money for all that. There is no shortage of money in society. The question is that we want to ask who manages it. Now, here in the general election, the British political parties are behaving as if all our money comes from taxation. And in reality, taxation is a consequence of both government and private sector spending. It's not the source of finance for that spending. In other words, taxation happens after a government or the private sector has invested and spent money into the economy. And it makes sense. You know from your own experience that when you get a job, you have no money if you're unemployed. You get a job. At the end of the month, you get some income. And when you get income, you pay taxes. Taxes are a consequence of investment and spending. They are not the thing that finances investment and spending. That thing is the banking system and the central bank. And it's done mainly through government borrowing, which is a good thing. It isn't for the government, because it's very easy. Right now, yesterday, the British government decided to issue a bond on the international capital markets. In other words, they asked the private sector to lend money to the British government. They found that their issue was oversubscribed 6 times. In other words, they asked if they could borrow money from the finance sector, and more than 6 times the numbers needed to provide that finance offered money. In other words, the private sector is desperate to lend to governments like the United States or British governments because governments are the safest bet in the world. And why? Precisely because behind every government and behind the British government, there are 30 million taxpayers. And you know what? There's a new one born every day. They pay their taxes. So borrowers know that the money to repay the debt comes from the taxation of citizens, and that in Britain we have a good taxation system. This is the safest place in the world to put money, is into the British government. So the British government has no trouble at all raising finance. And of course, the British government can be supported by the Bank of England, which is only an arm of government. It's not independent. It's certainly not private. We nationalised the Bank of England in 1947 after it messed up in the 1929 financial crisis. So it's really just another government department. And it can help to lower the price of borrowing by buying up some of those bonds in the capital markets. So for the British government to borrow at the moment, people are throwing money at the British government. So there's no problem raising finance. And then that finance, that is invested. And when it's invested in productive activity, which creates employment, that generates income and it generates tax revenues, which can be used to repay the debt. Our problem is if we borrow money and it's used instead for speculation or for gambling, for investing, for example, in London's housing market, which is just a gamble. People are gambling that London house prices will rise forever. And that's what they dreamt about, during tulip mania or during the dot-com bubble. Everybody believed that the dot-com thing would go on forever. Right now, everyone believes the London property prices are that's speculation, that's gambling. If you invest in speculation, it's very hard to guarantee that you'll get the money back to repay the debt. If you invest in productive activity, which creates employment, that generates income tax revenues and keeps the whole thing in balance. The Labour Party have promised free education. And of course, the answer is, oh, no, we can't afford this. I mean, in the United States, apparently the Americans can't afford a decent healthcare. That's absolutely rubbish. When governments invest in education, first of all, there is a long-term benefit to society. I mean, I've worked in developing countries where the children are not educated, where there is not a decent education system. And those economies go backwards, they don't go forward. So education in itself generates benefits for society. But the other great thing about it is that if you have to build a school, you have to hire a construction company and construction workers and so on. And these people are employed by the education system. They earn income, pay taxes, and that helps to pay for the investment in the school. Alternatively, the government hires school teachers. Now, believe it or not, school teachers get paid every month and they pay taxes every month. And like construction workers, their taxes go back to the government. This is something called the multiplier, where government investment multiplies economic activity. Not only do they pay income taxes, but they go shopping and they pay VAT or other types of taxes. The shopkeeper then delivers those taxes to the government. Shopkeeper, having sold products to our school teacher, makes a profit, and then the government taxes those profits, or capital gains, or corporation tax. And then, so the government receives revenue at several levels for its investment in education. And that's why investment in education is so eminently affordable. So education, unlike involvement in investing in bombs, which are destructive and which don't generate employment and income necessarily, investment in education pays for itself. Investment in health pays for itself. Investment in social care pays for itself. And we have to start understanding those concepts, those economic concepts of the multiplier, because our politicians want us to believe that there is no money, and that is a lie. Well, I think, first of all, the term growth is a very recent invention, and it's a bizarre invention. Growth, as something that we understand in relation to nature, means that something is seeded, it grows, it matures, and then it dies. But in an economic sense, invented in the 1960s by the OECD and by a Financial Times journalist, Samuel Britton, in their eyes, growth is something that's exponential. It can go on forever. Well, that is a delusion, because what economists think of as growth is a sort of arithmetic process, which can be exponential mathematically. Right? You can go on forever in mathematical terms. But in nature's terms, or even in society's terms, we're born, we grow, we mature, and then we die. We have just limited amounts of labor. We have finite amounts of the ecosystem. So the ecosystem is on a growth graph. If you think about a graph, it just goes like that. It's straight, really. Whereas money and growth can go in exponentially. So I argue that we should never use the term growth. It's unnatural, it's bizarre, it does not apply to the economy. What we should be looking at is the level of employment, the level of economic activity, the level of interest rates. Are they too high? Are they too low? We should be looking at the level of inflation, the level of deflation. Is it too high? Is it too low? And then government and economists should be adopting policies to adjust the levels so that they're in balance. If unemployment is high, then the level of unemployment must be brought down. If employment is too low, then it must be pulled up. We must stop thinking, and especially those of us who are environmentalists, we should never use the term growth, because that implies something exponential about our economic activity, and that can't happen. That's unsustainable. I think we should put both people but also nature, or the ecosystem, at the heart of economic policy. And the fact that economists have a blind spot for the ecosystem is one of the big economic threats that we face, because of course we all face climate change, and climate change is a result of thinking about the economy as growing exponentially. I saw a chart the other day of the discovery of carbon in the 19th century, and if you look at a chart of the discovery of oil and the exploitation of oil, it goes like this over the last 100 years. And that correlates with growth, with economic growth, right? Take away that oil and economic growth will go back to the mean, right? So when economists believe that it's down to economic policies that we're growing exponentially, they're deluding themselves, because all we're doing is fueling economic activity with carbon, and that is unsustainable. That is what's going to destroy humanity and indeed the ecosystem if we don't do something about that. So the word growth is pernicious, and we should never use it and play into that mindset.